Okay, so recently Neural DSP released the new 2.0 version of the OS for the Nano Cortex. And as I've been checking it out, one of the questions that kind of come up for me is, where does this position the Nano Cortex now in terms of how it relates both to kind of the Tonex world and also with the Quad Cortex? I feel like the update definitely brings a lot more of the capabilities from the Quad Cortex to the Nano Cortex. And what does that mean in terms of the value difference between the two devices? So I figured today I just kind of want to do a quick run through of the Nano Cortex and talk about kind of the feature comparison with the Tonex world and also with the Quad Cortex. So let's go ahead and start off with kind of just a quick run through of the new Nano Cortex update in case you haven't seen it yet, just so you can get a sense of what's there. So if we bring up the app, and I've got it running right now a capture from Amalgam of a Trurock OD50, and it's a nice clean tone, sounds like this. So just a really nice clean tone there. And as it was before, the Nano Cortex can run one capture, and then you can also run an IR if that capture doesn't include the cab inside it. The real difference for the Nano Cortex this time is in the new capabilities around the different effect slots. And so there are 2 pre and 3 post effects. And if we go ahead and go to the effects screen, you can see that here across the bottom. You've got the 2 pre, this one, and then the 3 posts. And what they've really done is expanded the number of effects you can run and also increase the flexibility of where you can run them. So in the pre, I can run the transpose, which is kind of the singular pitch effect that's on the Nano Cortex. This was included in the 1.0 version, but they've added compressors. They've added a whole set of overdrive pedals. They've added wahs and filters, and they've added some utility stuff, so EQs and gates and whatnot. So those can run in the 2 pre-slots. Now, the only one that can't run in the second pre-slot is the transpose. The transpose has to be in the first pre-slot if you're going to use it. But the second one, you can go ahead and use any of the overdrives, the EQs, the filters. And then the post slots, each slot can run any of the compressors or the utility, so the EQs and things like that. And then each slot can run a specific kind of effect in addition to those. So in the first slot here, we can run, again, the utilities or the compressors or a modulation. In the second slot, we can run the utilities or the compressors or the delays. And then the last slot, we can run the utilities and compressors or a reverb. So the modulation, the delay, and reverb, you can't move them around. So let's say, for example, you want to run, delay, reverb, and then a EQ. You can't run them in that order. The reverb has to come last. The delay has to come second last. So there is a little rigidity into that as to where the effects can go. But, they've also increased the number of types of effects. So you can see, the list of reverbs here. If we go to delays, there's a lot of different delays you can run, even a circular delay and a dual delay. So that's pretty powerful. And then the modulations, they've got a bunch of choruses, and they do have a flanger and a phaser and a vibe. So overall, they've added a lot of new features here. And again, let's go back and talk about where does it line up with kind of the Tonex and also with the Quad Cortex. So let's start talking about the Tonex. Okay, so now I have up the new Tonex editor. So this is a new feature from Tonex. And I feel like here I need to talk a little bit about my experience with the Tonex. So to start off with, I own the Tonex 1 rather than the full-size Tonex. The features are generally the same. It just kind of has less power in terms of storing number of presets and things like that. I will also say that historically, I've struggled to get the tones that I want out of the Tonex. I even did a video on this a while back. I'll link to it here. So I know a lot of people love the Tonex and have had a lot of success with it. I just can't seem to get it to be sounding as good as I want it to be. I can get a few good sounds out of it, but overall, I even purchased the Dumble pack. I purchased the Joe Satriani pack. I'm just not getting the tones that I like out of it. So just for what it's worth, I've always struggled with the Tonex, and with a new editor, I am going to jump back in and see if I can get more out of it. But for me, I always find myself coming back to my Quad Cortex most likely, but even the Nano Cortex, I have a lot of success in terms of getting the tones that I want out of it. So that out of the way, let's look at the Tonex here. If you've not seen this before, this is, like I said, this is the new editor. You've got a noise gate up front. You've got a compressor here that can be pre or post. You've got your amp, your tone model. This is the same as your capture on the Nano Cortex. You've got the cab, or you can bring in your own IRs here. And then you've got a modulation. They've got a chorus, tremolo, phaser, flanger, rotary. Again, it can be pre or post. Delay. They've got digital or tape, again, pre or post, so it can move around. And then reverb. They've got 4 spring reverbs, a room, and a plate, and it can be right after the cab, or it can be at the very end. So prior to the new update for the Nano Cortex, I feel like the effects in the Tonex world, there's a lot more available. There's a lot more flexibility in it. But if we go look at where things stand now, and here's something that I put together, based on my understanding of the kind of the two ecosystems. And we can see that the Nano Cortex really has added a lot of stuff that is in some ways matching the Tonex, but in other ways is kind of far surpassing it. So, from a noise gate, both have noise gate capabilities. It can be before the amp, it can be after the amp. They're about even there. Pitch shift, the Nano Cortex has the transpose capability. The Tonex doesn't have that. The Nano Cortex now has overdrives built into it. These are models of overdrives. For the Tonex, if you want to have an overdrive in front of it, it needs to be part of the tone model. And a lot of tone models do have the drive pedals built into it, but you don't have that flexibility to break apart the tone model and the overdrive. They both have compressors. They can be both pre and post. I think the Nano Cortex does give you option of what kinds of compressors you want to have. The Tonex only has one type of compressor. For modulation, they both have a good set of options. The Tonex is a little more powerful because you can have modulations before the amp or after the amp. On the Nano Cortex, you can only be after. And then generally, I think probably the thing missing most on the Nano Cortex, there's no rotary, there's no tremolo. They do a vibe, but that's not really the same thing. For delays, again, the Tonex has the capability to put the delays before the amp. The Nano can only be after the amp, but the Nano Cortex does give you, I think, a larger set of delay types, and the ability to have a dual delay or a circular delay or a reverse delay. I mean, that's way more kind of delay capabilities than the Tonex can give you. On the reverbs, again, on the Tonex, you can move the reverb around a little bit. On the Nano Cortex, it has to be last. And with the Nano Cortex, the biggest thing for me here is it's missing what I consider 2 key reverb types, spring and plate. For me personally, the absence of the plate is the bigger one. I use that a lot on my Quad Cortex. I'm not sure why they didn't include that. It could be maybe the spring and the plate reverb requires more CPUs than the others do. I don't know. And then, the Nano Cortex has added, new capabilities that the Tonex doesn't have in terms of it has filter and wah capabilities. You can hook an expression pedal into the Nano Cortex and control a wah. And on the EQ utility, you have some dedicated, graphic or parametric or low and high cuts. And you also have a doubler on the Nano Cortex. And that's something that the Tonex doesn't have. So I do think with this release of the Nano Cortex, it's kind of jumped ahead of the Tonex in terms of the number of effects. There's still some added flexibility in the Tonex because you can move the different effects both pre and post the amp. But on the Nano Cortex, I think you're getting more options. So the biggest thing for me is you have the separate overdrive pedals that you can control. So these overdrive models, and there's a bigger selection of delays especially, but also a little bit the reverbs. So it'll be interesting to see kind of where Tonex goes with this. Are they going to be adding in more types to kind of match this? And I think I said this in my initial Nano Cortex 2.0 video. One thing that's great is kind of, I think the competition between the two is pushing them, and we're getting more and more kind of from these devices at this lower price point. So speaking of price, let's go ahead and compare the Nano Cortex against the Quad Cortex and see if the new 2.0 release for the Nano, what does it mean in terms of if you should get the Nano versus the Quad? So what I did is I went ahead and grabbed the full device list from the Quad Cortex, and I went ahead and put something together that shows which ones are on the Nano Cortex. So let's go ahead and jump in here. So obviously the Nano Cortex does not have amp models. You can only run captures. So that's a major difference right there. The Nano Cortex is not an amp modeler, and therefore you're also not going to get the plugins on the Nano Cortex. The Nano Cortex is only for running captures as the amps. And on the Nano Cortex, the cabs are a little bit different. They're more just IRs. On the Quad Cortex, you have a larger list of cabs available. There are cabs available on the Nano Cortex, but you don't have as much flexibility in terms of where the mics are and things like that. So let's move on to the overdrives. So the Nano Cortex has 8 overdrive models included. Obviously, the Quad Cortex has a good number more. You can kind of see which ones overlap here, which ones are missing. So we're missing, the Marshall Blues Breaker or the Marshall Governor. We're missing some of the Boss stuff. For me, we're missing the Freeman, but that doesn't surprise me. The Freeman overdrive model has a lot of features on it, and I wouldn't expect you'd be able to run that on the smaller unit. The main one that stands out to me that I think is an issue is the Myth drive. So I think you need to have a Klon style overdrive on the Nano Cortex, and I hope that they're going to add that soon. I'd also love to see the Nobel OD1. That's one of my favorites, and maybe the Vermeer Ray. But overall, I think they picked the right kind of overdrive models to include on the Nano Cortex. I think the biggest one, like I said, missing is that kind of having that Klon style overdrive. In terms of delays, most of the delays from the Quad Cortex are included on the Nano Cortex. You've got the analog, you've got digital, you've got dual, you've got a dual reverse, you've got a circular, you've got a tape. You don't have the simple ping pong or the simple or the regular reverse, but figure you've got the dual reverse that covers the reverse. So in terms of delays, I think they've pretty much nailed the things that they needed to port over to the Nano Cortex. In terms of reverbs, again, I think they hit all the major ones. I'd like to see a plate reverb and a spring reverb eventually brought to the Nano Cortex. Like I said, the plate is the one for me that's kind of the most obvious missing. I don't really care for the spring reverbs on the Quad Cortex, so I'm not unhappy that they're not there. And the shimmer reverb, I don't ever expect the shimmer reverb to be on the Nano Cortex. I don't think it has enough processing power to do that. In terms of compression, I think, they brought over the key ones. Obviously, there's no side chaining on a Nano Cortex, so you're not going to have those. Again, I think probably the biggest one for me is the dual compressor. I use that a lot, especially in front of the amp. And so having that missing, I wish it was there. But the other ones are covered. You've got the Legendary 87, you've got the Opto, you've got the Solid State, you've got the VCA. In terms of pitch shifting, again, this is another one that, pitch shifting can take a lot of CPU. So I'm not expecting, for example, to see the mini voicer on the Nano Cortex anytime soon. I think they've got the transpose. There is some amount of harmonization you can do with that. I think it probably works well enough. Maybe eventually they might add like a polyoctaver or something like that. But overall, I think they've hit the nail on the head there. For modulation, I think you've got a good set of, choruses here. You've got a flanger, you've got a phaser, you've got the vibes. The rotary and the tremolo and the vibrato, I think those could be ported over at some point, hopefully. And then for the filters, the environment filter, the Love Meet, I think those are the major ones. I think they got a good sampling of the wahs. And for the EQs, I think they probably hit the ones that they needed to. I don't know that the parametric 8 is ever going to come over. That's probably too much CPU horsepower needed. So I think they've got the EQ covered there. And then in terms of IRs, it's a different kind of thing. So there's no ability to run dual IRs on the Nano Cortex. I think it's probably would be the single or the single light would be the one that's most comprehensive, but you can run IRs and that's good enough. And then the utilities, you've got the adaptive gate, you've got utility gate, you've got a volume, you've got a doubler. To me, that's a big deal. And obviously you don't have any of the blends because you're not running kind of parallel processing on the Nano Cortex. So running a blend or side chaining is not really applicable. So when we think about comparing, what's in the Nano Cortex to the Quad Cortex, I'm going to break it into two parts. One is things I think that are missing from the Nano Cortex that I think are realistic to maybe add in. I would love to see a second capture added so that you could run a capture of an overdrive pedal in front of an amp. I think that would give a lot of flexibility in terms of not being limited to the overdrive models that are selected. Obviously, I talked about there's a few overdrives I'd like to see added. There's maybe the dual compressor I'd like to see added. There's a few reverbs I'd like to see added. But overall, I think if you added like one more capture into the signal chain in kind of series, I think that would be a big deal. And it'll also allow you to run maybe like a capture of a preamp and then a power amp capture. Outside of that, I think the Nano Cortex, there's a lot there, and there's a lot of flexibility. Now, if we think about what's on the Quad Cortex that I think will never be on the Nano Cortex, it comes down to a few things. One, obviously we talked about the amp captures and the plug-in compatibility. Those are never going to be on the Nano Cortex. The Nano Cortex is about running captures as the amps and then building effects around it. Second, you're never going to have parallel processing on the Nano Cortex. It's always going to be kind of a single thread. So if you're not going to run dual amps, you're not going to do kind of wet dry or wet dry wet kind of stuff. That's never going to happen on the Nano Cortex. It's kind of a single chain, and I think that's fine. So obviously you could buy multiple Nano Cortexes for the price of a Quad Cortex. You could probably have at least 2, if not 3 of them for the same price. So if you want to run dual amps or something, you could do that. The other thing about the Quad Cortex is the number of inputs and outputs you have. So you've got 2 inputs, you've got multiple kinds of outputs, you've got a effects loop. So the Quad Cortex, you could be running, a guitar through it, a bass through it. People run vocals through it. So there's all kinds of power there for the Quad Cortex that you can do that the Nano Cortex obviously will just never do. But I do think if you're looking to kind of get into the neural DSP, at least the captures-based neural DSP world, there are less reasons to prefer the Quad Cortex over the Nano Cortex. There's a lot of capabilities here. You can get a lot of great tones out of it. And I think it's a great way to bring more people into the neural DSP kind of ecosystem and let them try, the effects and the drives and all the captures that are available in the Cortex Cloud, which is thousands of them. Many of them sound awesome. So I think in general, the Nano Cortex ends up being a much more interesting comparison against the Quad Cortex. And, if you're someone who was kind of on the fence between the two, and it's like, do I really need to spend the extra money for the Quad Cortex? I think unless you want to run the plugins or run dual amps and things like that, there's an argument to be made that the Nano Cortex is really all you need. So I think it's really made a leap forward, and I'm excited to see where they take it. And I'm hoping maybe the next version of the Quad Cortex, maybe they push that, and maybe we get more capabilities out of that. I know with the Rabia plugin, there's some synth capabilities in that plugin that they're going to port onto the Quad Cortex. So maybe just more and more, we're going to see a lot of new capabilities on the Quad Cortex. So I think they really need to do that because they've really brought the Nano Cortex way up towards kind of being comparable with the Quad Cortex in many ways. And I think they need to go ahead and push the Quad Cortex even more. So if you were considering, these devices, I hope you found this helpful. And as always, thanks for watching.